So I wanted to record a little video to help explain this experiment that I proposed to you for the carrying capacity effects quiz. So here we have in this area, this is similar data to what you saw in your book. The times are just the time in the experiment. The theoretical growth, that was what you calculated that, if it doubled every half an hour, that's what you'd get. And then the realized growth, this was the data that they actually gave you in the table. So since the population peaked out at around 520, and then after that declined, but it was able to stay there for a little while, I'm guessing that the carrying capacity would have been a number similar to this, maybe a little bit above it. So carrying capacity would have been about 525 up to this point. Then you get to a certain point where you've got a depletion of nutrients. So now the carrying capacity is zero because there's nothing left to feed the bacteria in the culture. So as you see, our carrying capacity goes from 525 sharply down to zero because there is now nothing left in that environment to support life. So here's an example of what a graph of this would look like. We have our population size over here, we have time over here, and this blue line represents our theoretical growth. The theoretical growth is doubling every half an hour, and this gray line is carrying capacity. And as you can see, it starts out around 525 and then sharply goes down to zero and then stays at zero. Now, when you're over carrying capacity, your population is going to crash until it reaches carrying capacity, which will become zero in this case. And the reason we say it has become zero, as I said before, there's nothing left in that environment to support life. So there's going to be way more deaths than births, right? Because think about it, if you have nothing to eat, how are you going to live? So this orange line here, realized growth, as you can see, it starts to follow the theoretical growth. We hit the tipping point of carrying capacity, and for a little bit, it's leveled out. But then all of a sudden, there's no resources, and you see that sharp decline. So now I propose the experiment to you of what would happen if you were to refresh the nutrition in this environment one time when you reach the maximum population. So in this graph, this is the same time, the same theoretical growth numbers, the same realized growth numbers, except I had to extrapolate what they might be up to a certain point. So the time when we reached the most bacteria in the container, we had at 3.5 hours in, we had 520. So if at that point we added enough nutrition to raise the carrying capacity to 2,000 bacterial cells, this is a thought experiment. Obviously, I'm not sure that that's a thing you can calculate easily, but let's say you did. Now your carrying capacity goes from about 525, it increases to about 2,000. So you see your realized growth means that you can keep doubling past that. But now your carrying capacity is 2,000. So when you get close to that number, you're going to level off and then crash, right? So here at 4.5 hours, we get close to that. We've reached our carrying capacity. So now there's no more nutrition left and we're not going to refresh it again. So it goes to zero and stays there. And then below here, you see the population crash until it gets to zero. So let's have the look at the graph to see what that would look like. And here's a graph. I've changed the scale a little bit just so that it all fits on here nicely. And I only went out to 9 hours because at that point, the population in the realized growth hits zero. So here's our exponential growth, the theoretical, the blue line. Here we have the gray line for carrying capacity. It started out, the original was approximately 500, 525, something like that. We suddenly added nutrition, so that carrying capacity increased. but the nutrition was then immediately depleted and it crashed back down to zero. So again, when our population was increasing, it hit a peak at the same level as the carrying capacity, although it hit it a little bit later. And then after that, it sharply drops off to nothing. The other example that we had in this thought experiment was what would happen if you would add more nutrition to the system every 4 hours after you started adding it when it reached its peak. So again, we have the same time, we have the same theoretical growth, same realized growth. I just used this same data from this experiment over here and extrapolated some numbers beyond the 9-hour mark and what would happen if you're adding the nutrition that would raise the carrying capacity to 2,000. And I just picked that as, we're going to use the same amount as we did in this one, but instead of adding it only once, we're going to add it every 4 hours. So we're going to see if we can sustain this culture by adding more nutrition regularly. So we look down at the graph here. And again, I had to change my scale just a little bit. It still goes to 3,000 here, but it goes out to 16 hours. So that would be like adding, again, around the 3.5 hour mark. You're adding it again around the 7.5 hour mark. You're adding some more around 11.5 hours, and then you would add some more around 16 hours because you're adding it every 4 hours, and you started at 3.5. So here we have our same blue line. That's our theoretical growth, and it just goes off the chart. That's why it appears to have stopped, but it would be clear out off the screen. It would go so high. And then we have our carrying capacity, the same gray line, and it starts around 500, sharply increases to 2,000 because we dumped a bunch of nutrition in there, stays at 2,000 for a little bit, and then all the nutrition is depleted because our population reached carrying capacity. And when it reached carrying capacity, there was like nothing left in that environment. So it starts to crash. And just in time before we get to a population of 0, in the nick of time, we get in there and we add some more nutrition. So we raise the carrying capacity again, growth happens up until it reaches that, and then it starts to crash again. See how we have carrying capacity goes back down to 0 when we reach carrying capacity? Because there's no more nutrition left. And then it goes back up again because at 11.5 hours we added some more, and it's just in the nick of time. As you see, the population's decreasing here down to this minimum here. It starts to re-increase till it hits that value of carrying capacity, and then it starts to crash again. But just in the nick of time before we hit 0, here we go, we're adding some more. So you see that this has that up and down nature. That's pretty similar to what would happen in a seasonal environment. Like, for example, if you've got a population that thrives in the summertime, their population numbers go up in the summer and they go down in the winter, and it just kind of oscillates at the carrying capacity of that environment. Now, the reason that the carrying capacity in those outside environments stays the same and is not a changing number is because we assume steady amounts of nutrition, steady amounts of resources, steady amounts of predation, steady amounts of disease, and all of those things that would impact the number that is the carrying capacity in any given environment. In a closed system, however, nutrition can go from supporting a large group to supporting none instantly. When you run out of resources, they're just gone in a closed environment. So one thing you would notice, though, I'd like you to pay attention to, in this repeated refresh of nutrients graph we have here, you notice that first little addition of nutrition just in the nick of time, right? It lasted us a little bit of time before we hit carrying capacity again. But then we added more, and it didn't last us as long before we peaked again. And then, we started crashing again. what you might realize is that as the number of population size increases, the either more often you would need to refresh the nutrition or the larger volume of nutrition you'd need to add. Either one of those two things would allow you to keep pace with the growth of the population. But if you don't keep up with that, and make it so that it represents an open system where the carrying capacity is always going to be limited just like by the space. If you get behind in adding nutrition to that, it's just going to crash. Now, think about this like feeding your fish at home, right? Say you have a fish tank and you go on vacation, and every day you feed the fish. It's a closed system. There's no nutrition coming into there unless you feed those fish. Well, if you go on vacation and nobody feeds your fish for you, your fish are all gonna die, right? And when you come home, you add more nutrition to that fish tank, but those fish are dead already. So that's kind of what's happening with the bacteria here. You know, if you're talking about an environment out in the wild, well, you don't have to go out and add nutrition to that pond because that pond has other things that are constantly adding the nutrition back. That's the fish. You know, if the fish, like say, eat bugs, bugs are always landing in the pond for the fish to eat. If the fish eat algae, the algae is always growing for the fish to eat. They can't eat it as fast as it grows back. So that's why carrying capacity in a wild environment doesn't change, whereas in a closed environment, it does. I hope that explains this a little bit better for you.